Yes, so the idea with competence practice is that competence practice has a temporary performance decrease. Players
Hmm.
often perform worse while they're engaging in high competence practice because it's really difficult to figure out the solution to a very difficult problem. It's like when you do a maths equation on a whiteboard in front of the class and it's really difficult, you're going to make five or six mistakes. You're going to look like you're stumbling through it before you might get it, for example. The same thing happens to our players. So you have this latent learning effect. So you have temporary performance decrease and then steady performance increase, which is more robust against forgetting. So that's what we call learning.
Welcome back to my podcast called Science and Sports. I'm, as usual, your host, Simon. And today I'm very happy to have a guest here on my show, who I met in Stockholm the first time. And now I have the chance to talk to him again. Job Fransen. Hi, Job.
Hi, Simon. How's it going?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for getting up early. I know the time difference is pretty big from Germany to Australia. So thank you so much for making it happen.
No problem. I'm very impressed by the things you're doing. So happy to support.
Thank you so much. Job, I want to talk to you a little bit today about the differences or maybe also similarities of learning in practice, also about your talk practice design you hold in Stockholm on the IHF World Championships this last year. Um, Learning and also what's on the other side of the spectrum looking good in practice. But before we jump into that, can you give us a brief introduction about you, about your work, and also why you went to Australia, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so my name's Job, and I'm originally Belgian, which we were just discussing offline before. But now I'm Australian, live in Australia. I work at a university called Charles Sturt University, which is a university in a regional town on the east coast of Australia. And I always say I'm very lucky to live in a place where everyone else wants to take a holiday. So I'm very, very fortunate. Um, my academic work has spanned the last 15 years where I've looked at how does talent or expertise develop in athletes, usually team sports players, and then more recently, how do team sports players develop skill, individual skill and collective skill? What is skill? How do we measure it? Which kind of interventions work and which don't? And in the last kind of 4 or 5 years, for those of you who've read some of my work before or who've seen me present somewhere, you would have seen that I've also become very skeptical about what we know about how people learn based on the scientific evidence we have. So that's become a big part of my work. Why did I move to Australia? Well, the biggest reason was job opportunity. For academics, there's very little opportunity in Belgium. I wasn't a high flyer. Therefore, I probably would have been overlooked in any academic system that was more traditional. I knew in Australia they were looking for academics in my area, and I eventually secured a job here, and it was as simple as that. Now, outside of my academic work, I also do practical work. I have a few companies, one that I own myself, and a few others I'm a partner in. But the one I own myself is called Skillac, and that supports high performance sports across the world, usually in the context of coach education. So we help coaches develop better practice sessions. And maybe that's a good introduction to kind of what also my talk was about. So I've been going kind of all over the world, which included in this case Stockholm at the IIHF coaches conference, to try and tell people that even though coaching is an art and a big component of it is art, 50% of it is also science. There are scientific findings that help us implement best practice skill acquisition to develop better practice sessions. My idea is always this: the coaches spend such little time with their athletes. When you look at it in the whole scale of a week, you might only spend a few hours with your athletes. Of those few hours, they might only spend a few tens or dozens of minutes in exercises that you designed with a specific tactical or skill purpose in mind. If we cannot be extremely intentional and deliberate about how we design practice, we risk compromising the most important component of our week just because perhaps we don't know how to adhere to best practices. So that's most of what my work is doing now.
Thank you for the introduction. I want to before I start with some serious questions, one more thing about Australia I want to know from you. Are there actually so many spiders as you see on the social media?
Well, let's say we have to have our house kind of sprayed against spiders and kind of other creepy crawlies every 6 months, which is fairly normal. So there are a lot here, but it's hugely, let's say, overemphasized in the media, and people think of it way worse than it is. And you also become desensitized to it. In the beginning, you walk outside with shoes on. After 2 weeks, you're on bare feet everywhere. You don't go swimming when the sun starts going down 2 weeks into being in Australia, and you're probably swimming when the sun goes down. You know, you become desensitized to those things. But there are a lot of creepy crawlies, and you have to kind of, like them or know how to deal with them. My father was
Okay.
a biologist, so I'm fine.
The question was on my mind since the first time we texted back and forth. So happy to finally get it off. I don't know if I will visit you one day, but okay,
Sounds
back on
good.
topic. You mentioned your talk in Stockholm, and if I remember correctly, you started the talk with some principles about skill acquisition and about practice design rather than starting the presentation with like actual drills that coaches could do or that you will let your athletes do. Was it on purpose or what was the reasoning behind starting with those principles to lead everyone in
Yeah,
the same direction?
well, the reason for starting with principles is that if you want to impart knowledge, just like you are doing here, your ultimate intention is to teach someone how to fish, not to give them a fish, right? So this is the
Mm-hmm.
same thing here. What I want to do is I want to strengthen coaches and practitioners' knowledge and understanding of how skill learning works, not tell them which drills to do. In fact, I'm a big proponent of the fact that there is no single drill I could prescribe you, your team, without knowing it, without observing it, without being embedded in it for a long time. The drills that work for different reasons. One of the topics that I talked about in my talk is the topic of training for confidence or training for competence. So
Mm-hmm.
in some teams, when you make exercises fairly simple and repetitive, what you do is you increase temporary performance. You increase the confidence of those players to perform that skill, that drill. It doesn't lead to any long-term learning, but maybe the best thing that you could do for that team is to build their confidence. Maybe they were low on confidence. Therefore, when my colleagues say, don't do drills, don't do static drills, don't do unopposed drills, I don't think that is in line with skill acquisition principles. Skill acquisition principles are telling us that in order to understand what is best for your learners, you have to understand your learners. And sometimes different methods are best that are not necessarily leading to long-term learning. If you don't feel confident to take a shot at goal, is it really worthwhile putting players in a training drill where they have to shoot a lot? Wouldn't it be better to develop that confidence first? So I'm not prescribing, but I'm giving coaches these principles so they can reflect on it for themselves. I'm not a better coach than they are. I don't have the experiential knowledge and the intuition and the years of understanding and deep understanding of their sport. So I can't prescribe them what to do, but I can teach them how to catch a fish. And
Yeah.
hopefully, once they know the methods that work to catch fish, they can catch them for themselves.
Do you think, staying on the topic of the confidence, competence kind of thing, do you think there is a ratio which should be in each, let's say, practice, or um, over a longer time, over a week, over even a season long, that you should have a certain ratio of your drills which emphasize on those two aspects? Is it, let's say, for example, bad to shift the weight on confidence only, or is it even better to shift it on competence training? What's your take on that?
Yeah. So there's no ratio. And the reason for that is that if confidence practice or confidence training is what your team needs right now, then the best thing to give them is confidence training. The only thing that you can do wrong is to give someone's confidence training. And for the listeners who are perhaps less kind of experienced with these topics, confidence training would be your kind of low error training. It would be training in which you repetitively repeat the same movement solution over and over again. It might be kind of um, drilled unopposed shooting in basketball, for example. If you go for confidence training and this is your planning for a week, but you think that you are creating long-term learning, that's when you make the mistake. So the mistake that a coach can make is not which type of practice they use, but which type of consequence they think they get out of the practice they use. If you think you're going to learn but offer confidence practice only, you are wrong. If you think you're going to boost confidence but deliver or create high competence environments or practice environments only, which again for the readers unfamiliar, high competence practices, higher error rates, a post practice where decision making is coupled with the actual skill, where maybe information and tasks are more representative. If you do high competence training and you think your players are going to feel good, you're wrong as well. So there's no single ratio that is perfect. The mistake coaches make is not to be intentional about why they use certain types of practice. So again, it comes down to what I said before, is that the prescription of practice from me to a coach is irrelevant. I don't understand their conditions. What I can tell them is that unless they are intentional, they are probably leaving a lot of practice benefits on the table.
Mm-hmm. So what I was hearing out, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if you have a good, let's say, in-season planning with your confidence and competence training, that you could boost your competence, or not your competence, with the right amount of competence training, where you actually show the players that they can make mistakes, that it's not maybe working on the first time, but on a longer period of time they will increase their performance, right?
Yes, so the idea with competence practice is that competence practice has a temporary performance decrease. Players
Mm-hmm.
often perform worse while they're engaging in high competence practice because it's really difficult to figure out the solution to a very difficult problem. It's like when you do a maths equation on a whiteboard in front of the class and it's really difficult, you're going to make 5 or 6 mistakes. You're going to look like you're stumbling through it before you might get it, for example. The same thing happens to our players. So you have this latent learning effect. So you have temporary performance decrease and then steady performance increase, which is more robust against forgetting. So that's what we call learning. So competence practice leads to temporary performance decreases, but learning increases over longer periods of time. One of the things that I often say to coaches, again without prescribing, is think about what your preseason practice looks like. In the sports I work in, we have a lot of preseason grooving or getting into the groove of things, getting touches on the ball, lots of low opposition, kind of low intensity, few decisions, but lots of touches on the ball or the puck or whatever it might be. Now, what that does is it boosts temporary confidence, but the moment that performance increases, the moment you stop training, it already starts decreasing. So in preseason, what you should actually do is you should offer a higher dose of competence training, because it's in preseason that you can use the latent effect of learning to then get a boost in performance. Even though you haven't practiced this skill for a while, you get a boost in performance once the season occurs. So what I often say to coaches is, think about it when you do your preseason planning. What if we increase the dosage of competence practice in preseason versus confidence practice? What would you think about that? And oftentimes coaches are like, but that's not how we usually do things. In the past, we've always done it differently. So what I said in the beginning is, I explained to coaches why competence practice has this latent learning effect. Then it's up to coaches to understand how they will use that competence practice to create long-term learning effects in the context of their yearly planning.
Mm-hmm. What I'm interested in now, when you talked a little bit about that and about the methods of, let's say, the coach, how can the coach see if his practice is good in, let's say, the competence part, or if he didn't do much or didn't do enough? Because when I'm coming from this standpoint, if let's say a younger coach starts his coaching career, he might also start in the juniors. Is it different there? It's part A. And part B, how can he know if his practice right after he did it was good enough for the players to get better over the longer period of time, over a season?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And I'm going to start out by disappointing you massively initially. Even though we've studied skill acquisition for decades, most of our recent work shows, for example, in the context of just football, soccer football, there's something like 130 studies that have used a skill assessment, and over 200 skill assessments are used across those studies, showing us that we still don't know how to actually measure skill in football. If we knew, we'd find far fewer assessments and far more studies using those assessments, but we don't. Everyone's trying to look for an assessment, but no one knows how to really measure skill. So if it comes to how do we measure whether players have become more skillful, for example, or temporary decreased skill, we don't have anything that is better than the coach's intuition at the moment. Of course, like you said, if you're a beginner, your intuition is less honed, you might make more mistakes, and that's the way it is, right? There are a few things you can look out for. High confidence practice is usually practice with very few skill errors. It's usually practice where players feel really good. So you'll hear things like, oh, great, guys, that was a perfect execution. High competence practice usually looks very different. It usually has a lot of skill errors. It has quite a lot of player frustration. So players will sometimes turn on the coach and say, hey, coach, you don't know what you're doing. This exercise is not for us. Like, we don't understand what we're supposed to do here. And that might be confronting for a coach, right? Especially if you're a beginner, which is one of the reasons why, and I also presented this in Stockholm, mostly when coaches tell me, hey, Job, come and have a look at my high competence practice, what is actually being shown to me is more confidence than competence practice, because we tend to shy away from that competence practice. And I'll talk about what competence practice kind of should look like in a second. But basically, you can use those observations of, are my players figuring out, we call it figuring out the drill or completing the drill? Are they finding a solution to the problem that we posed in this exercise really quickly? And you're probably in the confidence part of the continuum. If they struggle to find a solution to a problem, hence they're making lots of mistakes and they need lots of trials before they get it right, you're probably more in the competence side. Another thing that we often see is that in confidence practice, decisions and actions are not often coupled together. So you might have, for example, one player passing to another one, following the puck, that player passing to another one, following the puck, but with no actual decision. The only decision you're making is to follow the player in front of you. That is usually confidence practice. But if you're passing to a certain player to escape defensive pressure, for example, then you're moving more towards the competence practice because you're coupling that skill with a decision component. And when coaches ask me, well, how do I know whether I'm in kind of the competence practice or the confidence practice zone? And they ask me, how do we deal with practice errors in that context? I usually say this, that we have this theory in skill acquisition, which is called challenge point theory. And it basically argues that there is a particular challenge or practice challenge in which both learning and performance are kind of optimized, right? What does that practice challenge have to be? Well, my argument, and this is not supported by research, it's supported by my experiential observations, my conversations with coaches over decades, is that practice to boost learning should be slightly more difficult than the competition demands. So, for example, if you're used to having one turnover per minute in the context of an ice hockey game, and again, I don't know if this is realistic. I don't really know that much about ice hockey just yet. But let's say that it's one turnover. Then your practice should create at least one turnover per minute or slightly higher in order to create a sufficiently large challenge to be able to push these players towards learning. If that challenge is lower, you're probably pushing them more towards boosting performance. You're reinforcing what they can already do rather than challenging them to do something beyond the skills they already have.
So get them out of their comfort zone, but not get them into a state of frustration to keep them increasing in their performance for the upcoming games in a season.
Yes, that's right. So we call it productive struggle. You have to, if you struggle to get to something, if you struggle to find a solution to a problem, that struggle can be really productive. It generates some sort of long lasting or longer lasting skill. So the idea here is if you understand the challenge you have to commit to practice in order for players to be in that kind of productive struggle zone, collectively or individually, that doesn't matter, then that allows you to boost long-term learning. Again, like what I said before, because we are relying on the long-term latent gains of competence practice, you don't see the immediate benefits of practicing for competence or practicing for learning right away. We don't know how long it takes either, but what we do know is that it likely takes longer for more complex skills than it does for relatively simple skills. So let's say, just for argument's sake, that it takes a month before you get latent learning effects from a group of practice sessions that you did. Then you have to use that to plan that into your practice, understanding that once you get those latent learning effects, all you will probably need for the rest of the seasons is a few boosts of that, mixed competence, confidence practice, a few boosts of that, 2 or 3 more for the duration of the season to keep the players at a certain performance level for the remainder of the season. There's lots of these frameworks that exist in our area, which are skill periodization frameworks, but I don't subscribe to them because I don't know how we can accurately periodize something that we can't even properly measure. So right now, and this is received both with glee from coaches as well as with frustration. When I tell coaches, well, you're the best resource we have to understand whether players are perhaps just boosting their temporary performance or accelerating their long-term learning. We don't have any better tools than you. Your intuition is the best we have. Coaches will say, oh, that's great. Thanks for recognizing my intuition. But at the same time, they're also going, well, how is it that you've been studying this for so long and you still don't really know how to measure skill? Is that normal? Aren't you supposed to help us? But that's the best tool we have at the moment.
Yeah, you explained that wonderfully, Job. Even for me as a German with English as my second language, I totally got everything you just mentioned. But it opened up another question for me because when you talked about it and everything made sense. for an individual in my head. But as we both know, in soccer, in ice hockey, you have 10, 15, 20, 25 guys even competing at the same time in the same practice in the same game against each other. How is it? Maybe you have to give me the short answer no again. But is it possible to measure for each player in which state he is in? If he's on the right track in the moment while the practice is happening? Obviously, I'm not talking about the monitoring systems that we also use with the heart rate stuff. Still mean topic of learning and getting better, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and your question's good because imagine this example. You've got 5 players in your team. The skill level of those players is fairly heterogeneous. So you've got one very skilled player, one unskilled player, then that kind of 3 that float in the middle. If you set your practice challenge to be optimal for the most skilled player in your group, then learning for them is optimized. But learning for all the other players who are less skilled is going to be so frustrating. There's a thing as creating training that is far beyond traditional competence training. In other words, you're creating training in which there is no productive struggle, just a struggle, right? So you're basically not training the 4 other players, you're just training one of the players in your team. So how do you deal with that? And it's a great question. And the answer is actually remarkably simple. Once you start considering that skill exists in 2 components, there's individual skill and there's cooperative skill. Cooperative skill is the skill that is produced by a team of individuals, each with their single independent role, but all contributing to the overall collective task aim. If your idea is to defend in a certain way, to turn over possession and then counterattack, then how often you turn over possession collectively is a cooperative skill metric. You can set your practice challenge at the level of a cooperative skill metric, not an individual one. That's why I used the example of turnovers before, because if player A, who's right in front of the puck, makes a mistake defensively, and because of that you don't turn over possession, that mistake is shared by every single individual within that group. Even though they weren't directly involved in that action, they might have been slightly out of position. Maybe they didn't communicate right. Maybe they didn't offer the right defensive pressure so the player could move forward, whatever it might be, right? That error is a shared error. As a result, it creates a shared information for all players, right? Because ultimately, what modifying practice challenge is, it's the way for coaches to modify the information that's available to players during a game or a practice session. If you create practice with low challenge, players get little information. That little information they get, they can kind of reinvest in the learning process, but nothing much happens. If you create practice that is extremely challenging, there is so much information. We don't know if we made a defensive mistake because our positioning was wrong, maybe our communication was wrong, maybe we didn't follow the right tactics. We don't know. The information is so overwhelming that we can't make sense of it. So our job as a coach is to curate the information that is available to the player. So it's just enough information that they can use it to reinvest in their learning process. That happens the same at the collective level. If we create a collective challenge of more than 1 turnover per minute, then that creates just enough information that it pushes the player just beyond their comfort zone. It increases their sphere of comfort just a little bit by making them push against the boundaries. Next time we do it, they'll be a bit more comfortable with that slightly higher degree of information. We can offer a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more and so on. So the answer is, don't set challenge for team sports. Don't set challenge at the individual level unless you're doing individual practice. Set it at the collective level.
But how do you get let's say at the end of the week, how to make sure that every player got in the reps, got in the movements that he needs to do, because in a collective, yes, they all do, in your case, the defend on in their own period, let's say. But for, let's say, the top 2, top 3 players with the most talent, even that might be not challenging enough for them. And on the other spectrum, the players who maybe, most of the times it's the younger players who don't get enough ice time or enough time on the pitch or whatever. How do you compensate for that? That
Yeah,
everyone has the same amount of learning and, in best case, boost of performance at the end of the week.
yeah, so that's impossible to control for, right? That's one. It is important to note that if you have a very heterogeneous group, then it is going to be really, really difficult to set the challenge in such a way that everyone learns equally. The best thing you can do there is upskill the worst players. And the reason is this: when I say it's better to upskill the worst players than the best ones, coaches usually go, that's crazy. Like, we're paying player X 65 million a year. We're going to upskill them. They're our best player. But think about it this way: if you start thinking about a team as a social cooperative structure, that means that the team isn't just the sum of the performances of the individuals that make up the team, but it's more than the sum of the individuals that make up the team, because it's the individuals plus every single interaction that that individual has with another individual. Might be, player A's opposition for player B in practice, or player A and B, player 2 versus 1 against player C. If you can upskill the least skilled players in a social collective, then every interaction they have with the best players becomes more quality or of higher
Mm-hmm.
quality. If it becomes of higher quality, you're upskilling the best players by upskilling the worst players. If you only upskill the worst players, the best players, the gap with the worst players becomes so wide that every single
Yeah.
interaction they have with them in practice, which still in many sports, I'm not saying all, but in many sports, the exposure to practice is still greater than the exposure to competition, right? If you practice with these players all the time, but they're not very good, and in fact, they're getting worse compared to you because your skill level is increasing, then you can't
Mm-hmm.
expect those players to keep increasing collectively as a group, right? So the best thing to do is to upskill the worst players. Now, why is this relevant? Is because what you mentioned is something that almost every coach asks me, because it comes down to this. Think about really good teams. Really good teams don't just have good on-field players, they've got good benches. And they've got good benches, not because it's great to bring a good player in during a game, but it's also amazingly great to play and compete with and against a really good player at practice. If you ask me, what's the one thing apart from exposure to practice? What's the one intervention I should make as a coach to ensure that my player's skill level keeps progressing and improving during the season? It's get them to play against better competition. Get them to practice with better players. I'll give you an example without naming names, but in the context of we have a sport here in Australia called rugby league. It's very similar to rugby, but it's 13v13, and it has a bit different tackling rules. So for the listeners who are unfamiliar, but basically, one proposal that is going around is that whether we can't hire almost retired players from other teams, give them coaching contracts, 50% coaching, 50% playing with the reserves team, and they are basically there in practice to be extremely expertful opposition for the main team. It's like a professional sparring partner. Think about, the best boxer they don't want to box against the 50th best. They want to box against the second best or the third best, because they understand that the only way to keep developing in sparring and training, right, the only way to keep developing is to compete with the best, to train with the best. So in the context of that, and when we talk about practice challenge, you can't control it. But what you can control to some degree is the depth and the strength of the core unit of players that you have. The better that is, the more competitive training sessions are going to be, the more skill learning is generated by them.
Yeah. Staying on topic of your example with the rugby and with the coach on the reserve squad, when you shifted to ice hockey, because that's just my sport, is it, you think, useful as to have, let's say, an assistant coach or a head coach who can dress up and can join the practice once in a while to show them not that he can do it, but show them that he's still on a level that he can be a, same as in your example, good opponent in practice?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, this, because again, so I do maybe 200-300 practice observations per year, right? And I would say that most of the teams that I observe are at the kind of elite level of competition. Almost all of them would have coaches as opposition. Now, I've been in places where the coaches are specifically selected because they're good coaches. And I've been in places where coaches are specifically selected because they're good coaches and also still good players. I think the
Mm-hmm.
second strategy is more useful. If you're going to use coaches as opposition, if your coaches are like me, middle-aged, fat, and lazy, then they're never going to offer an opposition that is reasonable to challenge even low-level high performers. And this is challenging because imagine this situation, right? Belgian Aussie guy goes to an ice hockey team, observes practice. Coach asks him afterwards, "What did you think of practice?" And I tell the coach, "Look, coach, I know you dressed up, but even I can see you're getting a bit slower. You know, you're not always making the right decisions. You're looking elsewhere, not focused on the task, etc." Imagine that situation, right? Of me
Mm-hmm.
saying something like that, but it is the reality of a lot of the observations that I do. I have to tell the
Okay.
coaches that they don't actually offer reasonable opposition for the players in the context of the games they design. That's why, like what I said a few minutes back, most of the observations that I do, I ask coaches, well, where do you think you kind of sit in that confidence competence continuum? And they always estimate to be more towards the competence side than I do. One of the reasons is because when coaches are involved in drills and they're kind of unfit, getting a bit slower, whatever, it feels pretty hard for them. But for players, it's a breeze. They figure it out after a second. So they're usually really difficult conversations to have, but it's very, very common.
Mm-hmm. But I think, I don't know if we talked about the same dressing up. I meant to ask you about if he really like suits up back in hockey gear as a former pro player. I think it's the same you mentioned or talked about with rugby, yeah?
Yes, but
Okay, good, good.
of course, the question is always, how good is the coach still?
Yeah.
Are they reasonably good or are they very, very, very good? Right? And that is still, for coaches, this is a difficult conversation to have. It's like telling someone they're getting old, right? Or asking someone about whether their hair got grayer. It's very confronting.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll give you another example again
Yeah.
without using or using names. But one of the best teams that I've ever worked with had a genius implementation of some of the work we did, which is they started recruiting support coaches, so assistant coaches, video analysts, whatever it might be, not for their video analysis skills, but for their basketball skills. And then they would train them in video analysis later. Why that is so good is because you're basically hiring in extremely expertful opposition. These are not like players who played until they were 14 and then kind of got interested in coaching basketball. They're players who've played until they are 21 or 22, extremely fit, very tall, whatever it might be, that form extremely challenging opponents in practice when we can't use our own players. But at the same time, they can still fulfill an auxiliary role in the sports team as, for example, video analysts. So that's just one example, but I've seen multiple examples like that before across kind of different organizations I've been. So it's a very common question for people to ask.
One last question on that topic before we can wrap it up, if you don't mind. Do you think the coach can lose credibility if he doesn't necessarily suits up, but if he joins the drill, let's on a shooting spot or a passing spot, and he was a pro player, do you think he can lose his not authority, but maybe credibility is the right word, what I'm looking for the players or of the players when he messes it up?
Yeah, hopefully I understand the question right. I think that doesn't really matter. I think the privilege I get is that when I do, my work with high-performing teams, I end up in the cafeteria surrounded by players and I'll have a conversation with them, or I'll end up somewhere else and players are grabbing a coffee and I end up having a conversation. They value their coaches not for how well they can still play, but how good they are at coaching, how well they support their career development, how well they support their aspirations as players, how eager they are to win. So I don't think coaches lose face necessarily. The only downside of getting involved is that you can think you are a better opposition because of your past than you actually are. While when we look at it, it is probably the thing that is going to generate the most long-term learning effects. And if that's something that you play around with, let's say to fulfill your ego, which sometimes happens, then that's probably not the right coaching method to use. And I would ask a question based on that when I observe. Again, it's not always welcome, and sometimes these are difficult conversations, but I would ask that question because it's so important, right? I always say, or I tend to use this kind of analogy, and I say, well, if you're working with high performers, you're driving a Ferrari, right? Wouldn't you want every single component of that Ferrari to work perfectly, to be perfectly oiled and lubricated and looked after and whatever? So why would we compromise on something so important as, for example, the challenge that we can offer in practice by wanting to be involved as coaches? And sometimes coaches have good arguments. They say, well, it's preseason training. We don't do one-on-ones and two-on-twos, etc. yet because it's obviously quite challenging to have players defend and short movements and decelerations and accelerations. So we do it for now, and that's a good argument. It's a good argument because you're doing the best with what you have. However, if 2 months later you're still doing the same thing, then that argument no longer works, right? So I again come back to what I said initially. My aim is to make coaches think about why they do certain things, to make them understand what the influence of those things is on how players learn. And if then coaches go, well, I'm very confident now that what I'm doing is the right thing, I'll back them all the way because I've taught them how to fish. They found the fish and they're fishing. It's up to them now. So these conversations happen as well.
Yeah, your analogies are on point, Job. I have to give you that.
Yeah, you have to remember, I do this a lot, right? So, and I often go to sporting teams where, again, you can also imagine lots of people talk to these people, right? And oftentimes they get talked to too much. They get pushed data all the time and spreadsheets and big stacks of folders of things to read. Sometimes making something simple in an analogy can be enough for it to stick for just long
Yeah.
enough to create a shared communication once that shared language and communication is created, we made one step forward towards better practice design.
100%, I'm right there with you, because a Ferrari and a fish is easy to remember, and it was like spot on. Spot on.
Thanks.
Job, one more thing. We talked probably about like 45 minutes now about practice design, about getting the players better, optimizing the practice with the coaches, in the time spent together. And my last question talking to you, or for you today, is if you could share one principle or one thing to my listeners, or to our listeners, that they should remember going out of the episode, what would that be?
I think the thing I would like them to remember is that effective practice design is not something we are taught, because it is almost impossible to prescribe it. If you've done a coach development course, within ice hockey, and maybe you have a certain certification, or in football, or whatever it may be, you may have learned some basic principles of how to design effective practice. But following those principles blindly is not going to work. They are so context and individual dependent. Just to give an example for your listeners, is if you're a coach who is really outspoken, you're very good at using words to get things done, what is stopping you from being more prescriptive than another coach? Maybe another coach who is more introverted likes designing practice and letting the practice run for itself without much intermission or without much feedback, etc. So, what I'm trying to say here is that your coach development has got you so far. If you want to take that next step, start being critical, open to new ideas, develop your own thinking and philosophy in the understanding that there is nothing really you can do wrong. You just have to be intentional with what you do and why you do it.
Amazing, amazing ending words, Job. But I lied to you. I have one more question, and that would be where people can find more about you and about your presentations, can contact you maybe if they want to learn more. And I promise that was my last question, and I let you start off with doing in your day.
Yeah, no. People can contact me. I mean, an easy way is through LinkedIn. But I'll also, Simon, give you the email address related to my company, where people can just, message me. I say that in every podcast. They can send me an email. If you did a practice session last night and you have a strange feeling about it, describe it to me. Send me not a 4-hour video of your practice, but send me a 3-minute clip. I'm happy to discuss with you, what worked, what didn't work. And I probably don't have the answer, but maybe I can help you ask the right questions. So you can contact me either through LinkedIn or through my company email address. If you're interested in my academic work, all you have to do is in Google Scholar, write down Job Fransen skill acquisition. You'll see my profile, and then you can look at all the academic work. Any questions you have about that or anything we discussed here, my email, if it's related to academic work, my email is always in my publication, so you can find me there. No worries.
I will put everything you just said into the description below. I hopefully don't forget it this time. And with that being said, thank you so much for joining me, Job. It was a pleasure talking to you again, seeing you again. And I wish you all the best. And thank you so much for bringing some insights about your job and about skill acquisition and practice design to me and also to my listeners. And yeah, like I said, it was a pleasure talking to you.
No worries. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Job. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the podcast, leave a rating or comment, and share it with someone who loves sports science. And for more content, follow me on Instagram at science _in_sports_. See you in the next episode.